I'm Graham Allison. I'm currently the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government. And I was dean of the school from 1977 to 1989, the so-called founding dean of its rebirth. Well, it's a long story, but in brief, I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, which when I was born there, it was a small city. Uh, I grew, I don't know whether I grew up, but I, in any case, lived there for the first 18 years until I went off to college. Went to public high school, was an athlete, had a great time. It was a great time to grow up there. I did football and wrestling and track. And then I went off to Davidson College, which is a small but outstanding liberal arts college in North Carolina, because our family had always gone to Davidson, and I was the first grandchild. My grandfather insisted that I go to Davidson. I had been somewhat unimpressed by Harvard, even though they had recruited me to come play football, and I came to visit, and it didn't seem to me the girls weren't that pretty, and it was cold. So my grandfather then died during my first year at Davidson. So after 2 years, I transferred and came to Harvard, because I noticed that all the books we were reading seemed to be written by folks at Harvard rather than Davidson. But I was greatly, I'm a great fan of Davidson. My brother went there after I did and graduated. And so then I finished here in 1962, won a Marshall Scholarship, went off to Oxford for 2 years, studied philosophy, almost became a philosopher. It was a great days for analytic philosophy, and then came back here and got a PhD. In the course of that, my mentors were Dick Neustadt, who was had come here to start the Institute of Politics, and Tom Schelling, who was a professor of economics, but who became involved in the Public Policy Initiative, and Henry Kissinger, whom I saw Monday in New York. He just turned 88, and whom I was his key course assistant. I almost went off with him to Washington in 1969 when he became Nixon's national security advisor, but we were just starting the public policy program here, and I was just a young assistant professor. So I decided I better grow up to be a professor here first, and so then one thing led to the next. I was always a good student. Yeah, I wasn't always a serious student. And when our family, education was important to my mother. My father hadn't gone to college. He's a small businessman in North Carolina. He was somewhat suspicious of higher education, and especially of Harvard, and his son going off to some faraway place, as he thought of it. But I was smart enough, and so it didn't require a huge amount of work.
What subjects interested you?
Well, as an undergraduate, I studied history. In fact, I came to Harvard I had read a book by Crane Brinton, who was a great Harvard historian, called Anatomy of Revolution. And so I came and actually went and knocked on his door in Widener Library and said I'd come all the way from North Carolina to study with him. He thought, where's this guy coming from and what is he doing? But he gave me a chance and was then ultimately my history tutor for my thesis as an undergraduate. And then at Oxford, I was mainly interested in analytic philosophy.
When you came here from North Carolina, did you feel somewhat fish out of water? Or?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I was very nervous about it because, again, I had been to New York before. I'd never been abroad. Didn't know very much about the North. It seemed far away. So this was very different times, and I had a very pronounced Southern accent. So it was actually quite a remarkable story because having been recruited to Harvard and admitted, but then told them no, I wasn't coming. In any case, the fellow who in the admissions office who 2 years later, when I called him up and said, I think I may have made a mistake. How about if I come? He said, let me check into it. And yes, okay, so it was not a very complicated process. But so I figured, well, I better check it out. So I came for the summer school just before school started, just to kind of see how it was going to work. And had so pronounced a Southern accent, so it seemed to the other folks, that in a philosophy class by Raphael Demos, who was a great ancient Greek philosophy professor, he asked a question about, well, what did Plato mean when he said this or that? And I raised my hand and gave the answer, and everybody laughed. And this girl came up to me afterwards and said, "That's so wonderful, just say some more." And I felt intimidated, and little by little, as my father said, I got beaten out of my accent.
Did you know you wanted to be an academic?
No, I had no idea I wanted to be an academic. And actually, when I came back from Oxford, at Oxford at Harvard was a great, well, Davidson actually was, I became to be more intellectually awakened. High school was not a big intellectual experience for me. And at Harvard, I was very excited about history and the study of history. But if you'd asked me, I would be more likely to be somebody doing something in the world. And then I went to Oxford because I kept thinking there's going to be some really smart people somewhere. So maybe if they're not at Harvard, they'll be at Oxford. And almost stayed there to do a PhD in philosophy. But then decided, well, but what's the point of analytic philosophy? I mean, what it does is clarify an issue, but it doesn't do anything about it. And so when I was going to come back, I applied to the law school, the business school, and the Gov department, thinking maybe I'd be a business type, or maybe I'd be a law school type, maybe I'll do the Gov department, which at the time was a very flexible. And so ultimately went to the Gov department, and then I think probably little by little got socialized into the notion that so Kissinger's a professor and Neustadt's a professor, maybe I could grow up to be a professor. So all this is happening about the time Kennedy becomes president. So he became president when I was a junior in college, and a whole bunch of Harvard people went to be part of the administration, and it was an idea that intelligence applied to government could make the world better. So that was in the air, and the idea of public service was a pretty compelling concept, and also romantic at the time. So I think probably, then in a Harvard context, you can flatter yourself into thinking, well, maybe I can both think about things in a way that make the world better, but maybe even sometimes do something about them. And people like Neustadt were a good example of somebody who had worked in government, but also worked in the university. So it wasn't as common. I mean, when Kennedy became president in '61, a number of people from Harvard, including George Bundy, who was the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, went to Washington. So it was becoming to be a more common idea. So I think probably that concept attracted me. Yeah.
Richard Neustadt, you mentioned, is a model of yours, but he was somebody you studied under. He was somebody, I suppose, who was a mentor.
He was a mentor, absolutely.
Can you talk about him a little bit, about him, and especially maybe his first vision for the school, as we begin to talk about your life in the school?
Well, Neustadt first was a giant, and remains one of the people whom I admire and love the most, and whom I profited most from learning from, being mentored by, being a friend of. He had come from Columbia, having written the best book on the presidency, and one that Kennedy picked up and looked at. The family selected him to be the first director of the Institute of Politics, and so he came to Harvard, and he was going to try to build the Institute of Politics, but he didn't quite know what that was going to be. And it was part of something that had been renamed the Kennedy School, but nobody knew what that was because it wasn't anything. And he taught his first course on the presidency, which I took, which I had just shown up as a graduate student. And then he sort of adopted me, and I became his key course assistant. And then he, would mentor me. So he was a great teacher and mentor. Now Neustadt, as I write in the chapter in his daughter's, the book that she pulled together after his death, was an odd entrepreneur. He was a great academic entrepreneur, but he, in his own terms, said that he created a tail, but he didn't have a dog. Okay? And this analogy was the notion that he had created the Institute of Politics, which he had a conception of, and this was somehow part of something that had been named the John F. Kennedy School of Government, which was actually the renaming of something that had been the Graduate School of Public Administration, which had been first established on paper in 1936 as part of Harvard's 300th birthday celebration. So here this thing had been created, it had built a building, but it never actually developed a faculty or students or a curriculum or otherwise. It had some students who would come to the so-called School of Public Administration in the Littauer building, and but who would then take courses in other departments. So there were I think it was 2 special courses that were given by the school. That was it. Okay? So it was essentially a ticket to Harvard. And it had many distinguished people come. Paul Volcker actually came to that program. So, but in any case, then the school was renamed after Kennedy was assassinated, with the hope that something would happen to it, but nothing much happened. Then Neustadt comes and creates the Institute of Politics, and it becomes a lively place, but it's a small operation. It's in a little yellow house across from Holyoke Center. It's got probably 8 or 10 rooms. It had 3 or 4 fellows each term. It brought a few visiting fellows. It had a faculty research group, and that was about it. And his hope was that somehow this would then percolate into something happening in the Kennedy School. Then Neustadt, again, was the source of something that was created called the Public Policy Program, which was at least going to be a special program at the Kennedy School. And he recruited and assembled a very lively faculty group of what we now call the Founding Fathers. So Tom Schelling, Howard Rafa, Fred Mosteller.
How did he manage to recruit all those people who were giants in their own field?
Absolutely. He was an amazing, he would go and have lunch with them and drinks with them and coffee with them and talk to them and tell them about the excitement of the idea. And these were all what Tom Schelling called distinguished misfits. So they were quite distinguished in their own field, but they didn't quite fit. Schelling was an outstanding economist, but not kind of a plain vanilla economist. And Rafa was an outstanding professor at the business school, but actually had more interest in the world, And Mosteller was a great statistician, but was interested in how these things would be applied. So there was some combination of the magic in the air, plus Neustadt having a big idea, and then there were a couple of founding brats who were Zeckhauser and myself. And so this little merry group sets off and tries to create a program, which they did.
How did he convince you to...
Well, he said this is going to be I had just I'd gotten a PhD in the Gov department and had been appointed an assistant professor in the Gov department. But he said, here's this very distinguished group, and we're going to be creating this new thing, and you can be part of it as well. So I straddled and kept my teaching in both the Gov department and then in the public policy program. He funded this. He and the fellow who was the dean at the time, Don Price, through a grant from the Ford Foundation, which was like for 5 years, but basically that was it. I mean, it was a 5-year grant. You could fund it for 5 years, and then, something was going to happen. And Neustadt would, I think, as I describe in that chapter, he didn't have any taste or inclination for fundraising, so he thought someone was going to come save him. And so he thought first the president of the university, Derek Bach, would somehow bail him out because you weren't going to let this thing fail. And then he would always say, "Well, we'll just go and plead that we're gonna sink, or you're going to help us," and that wasn't going to be successful. So he then came to the view that I should become the new dean, and I was of the view that John Dunlop should become the new dean. Now, Dunlop was a very distinguished member of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, who had been dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and been Secretary of Labor, was a great labor economist, but a person of national standing. And John was also a doer, so he could do things. And but John wanted to go back to Washington if there was a new administration, if he had an opportunity to, because he had had a short-lived period as Secretary of Labor. There's another story. And I wanted to go to Washington because I had never had a serious job in Washington and was now 36 years old. And there was going to be a Democratic administration since I was a Democrat. So I was hoping there was going to be. I mean, Carter was not elected yet, but if he got elected. So I once made a deal with Dunlop that, okay, if it was a Republican, he could go to Washington and I would stay. And if it was a Democrat, I would try to get a job in Washington and he would be dean.
Can we go back a few years to the beginning of the MPP program? So if he's built the tail, which is the IOP,
right.
Now the MPP is the beginning of the...
He's beginning to I guess, get a leg for the dog, I guess. That's right. It's a good analogy. I hadn't thought of it.
What was he... what was the creation of the MPP like? I presume you had several giants in their own field, strong characters, each perhaps with a slightly different vision of how all these parts could fit together to create a public policy program.
Well, that's interesting. As I say, the idea of public service was live. Okay, so this is like 1967, 8. There's been a faculty study group, which I was the rapporteur of, called the May Group, which Ernie May was chair of, which was looking at the so-called bureaucracy problem, which is why if all these guys are so smart and they have gone to Washington, the things look like they're not working very well, including Vietnam. And there had been the invention of so-called PPBS, program budgeting systems. In any case, something McNamara had created at the Defense Department, and Johnson had then decreed needed to be done across the whole government, that brought kind of applied economics to analyzing different programs. And so this, 4 or 5 very, very substantial people were kind of, okay, we're going to have a program, we're going to admit 20 students, they're going to be outstanding students, and then we're going to figure out what we're going to teach them. So then Neustadt, or somebody, I think Neustadt, organized a summer in which each of the courses that were going to be taught, the faculty members would do an outline of it and teach them to each other. So we would meet every day, I think. I think we got a place at the business school because we didn't have any rooms hardly. This is before we had any buildings. We were just living in the old Lift Tower building, but the Economics and Gov Department had captured all the offices. And so the different faculty members taught the classes to each other and, agreed, okay, this is what they'll be. And it was a very exciting summer. And there was a sense of a new mission and a new undertaking that, and then people's enthusiasms fed on each other, and they recruited a great group of students. Actually, all the students at the time got a full scholarship, so it was attractive for them. And again, there was no finance for this except for this money coming from a grant from the Ford Foundation. And this went till, I can't remember. So this is 69. So I guess it was like a 3 or 4 year grant. So then the Ford Foundation gave a second grant, which gave out in 1977 or 8. So basically, the school was running this activity on the notion that somehow or another it was going to be financed from somewhere. And then I know that. Yeah, now, sorry, I just lost track. So now it's 1973 or so, 2 or 3, and Derek Bach is president, a young former dean of the law school, and he gets enthusiastic about this because Dunlop was also thought this was a good idea, and Dunlop and Bach were buddies and had written a book together or writing a book together. So Bach endorses this activity from the perspective of the president of the university, but then comes up with his own conception, and he writes one of his annual reports, which were these major missives that he would do every year, on public service, in which he features equally 4 schools of public service at Harvard: the School of Education, the School of Design, the School of Public Health, and then this new thing called the Kennedy School. And these 4 would be the serving professions, in contrast to, say, the business school for businessmen or the law school for law. And Derek's, you can go look at the report. It's a 25-page report, carefully argued, all of this. But it was a conception that I think ultimately it was clear didn't make sense. And I think Derek finally concluded it didn't make sense after he noticed that, it didn't. It was like many paper strategies. You could have a dream, but it didn't connect in flesh and blood to incentives for anybody to do anything. And if somebody had come along and said, okay, so here's a few $100 million for this vision, who knows? We would probably have today the umbrella for public service, and it would be organized with 4 pillars and so forth. So it was a vision, but it was a vision of whatever it turned out to be a mirage. So all this is going on in 1974, 1975. So the program is still, the MPP program is going on. The police is giving out money. The former dean's, Don Price, has said he's going to step down. I'm trying to get off to Washington. Dunlop is trying to get off to Washington. Newstead is thinking, oh my God, we're going to sink. So it was a pretty exciting time, yes. I became a professor, I think, in 1972. So it was one of the shortest periods of time from being an assistant professor to a professor, both in the Kennedy School, the new Kennedy School, and the Gov Department. And so then I had taken a year's leave and gone out to Stanford, to that Center for Advanced Studies. And while I was gone, Neustadt maneuvered around and decided that I should become the associate dean of the school, and then that with Derek we would start planning to build a new building. So when I came back, so this must be 1975, became associate dean and had responsibility for trying to see what was going to happen to this space here, where we currently have the Kennedy School campus. And again, there's a huge long story about that. Let me just give you the short version. So Neustadt had concocted what he called the big plan. And this was something that he had cooked up with Bobby Kennedy and the family. And it was to capture this piece of land, which had been the end of the line for the subway, the Red Line. So it had been here for 100 years. the oldest underground in the U.S. And this was the car barn site. So when the trains would stop, if they need to be repaired, they would be here in this car barn of 12 acres. And when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, there was a big wall around this site, but you would hear squeaks and squeals coming out of it. And even the people in Eliot House would complain at night, that there would be these noises. So Kennedy was assassinated. State was in mourning. So how hard is it to now finally get the MBTA to move and get this site? And Harvard had been interested in this site for at least 100 years. So in any case, it was agreed this would be the site for the JFK Library, the Presidential Library. And then Neustadt, thinking of, okay, but we need to have a school to go along, if we're going to build a school, what better than to catch the wave of this library and then all this. So the big plan had the library, and then there was a little bit of space for the school, which initially was just a space for the Institute of Politics, but then we grew it a little bit. Okay? So then came this was the days of so this is like the mid-70s, of public objections to construction, that they didn't like, community movements and so forth. So the so-called community objected to this thing that was going to be built at this facility, including mainly people that lived on Brattle Street, so such a community, in which they said, oh, this is going to be horrible, that people were going to come. I remember at one of the meetings that people were going to come from Oklahoma with an RV wearing Bermuda shorts, going to ruin the character of the square. That was the imagery. And lo and behold, they defeated Harvard, which was hard to believe. I had a great window into this because I was living in a two-family in the Cambridge-Belmont line, in which an Irish guy owned the ground floor and owned the building, and we rented the top floor. And he was one of the guys that was part of this conspiracy to defeat Harvard. So we would hear, from his side what they thought they were doing. They would go get people in Dorchester and bus them over, these Irish guys to look like it was a committee of 100 that had come to a meeting, but they were all guys, his cousins or otherwise. But in any case, so this plan got defeated. And so when I became associate dean, so this is why I'm gone. So this is like 75 or 76. This thing has crashed. So with Hale Champion, who was then for Derek, was like the vice president for, administration and space and stuff. He and I and Neustadt worked out an idea. Why don't we, it's terrible that we lost the library, but why don't we keep the land? Because the Red Line had already agreed to extend itself out to Alewife or beyond. So they were building a new thing. So they didn't need this land anymore. They needed the stop that they had, but they didn't need this for their car barns. So we kept the land. And so now we're sitting with 12 and a half acres, which Harvard has title to, but which in principle is the place where the library was going to be, where the school was going to be along with the library, but now the library's not there, so now so then, but we have no money. Okay? So
was it titled basically to the Kennedy School?
To Harvard, but for the purposes of the Kennedy School. Okay, so Hale and I dreamed up the idea. So why don't we sell off a chunk of the land? Because it'd be nice to have a hotel in Harvard Square. At that time, there's no hotel, and I don't know. Maybe I guess as the people do the thing up, they can have some condos too, so then the land is more valuable. And then we get some money, and then we can build our building. Okay? So
this, of course, became the Charles Hotel.
Exactly. That's the Charles Hotel and those condos there. And then we kept control of this piece of land in the front, and made it because it was supposed to be the JFK Library. There should be some appropriate memorial component. So we did the JFK Library as part of it. And again, with the same money that we got from Friedman, the guy that built the hotel and the condos. And then we worked out a deal where I was nervous about the MDC, whether they're going to cut the grass, because this is our front yard. So we set up a little endowment that pays for the guys that cut the grass. So we now have a spectacular, park. It's got a very nice, understated, but I think appropriate memorial, with the fountain. It has fantastic quotations, this was Galbraith's idea. So Galbraith and Sorensen and I chose all those quotes. I mean, Sorensen had written, half of them or 2/3 of them, maybe all of them. And the park we didn't get finally built until I was dean, like 4 years in, because there was, again, some hassles with the MDC, or I don't remember exactly the details, but all the things came together. But so then we had this claim on this piece of land, and now we were getting some money, and then there's a couple of more circles to it that get a little complicated, because there'd been some money being given earlier to Harvard for a so-called international building, which was never built. And so Derek agreed that money could be transferred for the building of this building. That made the people at the Center for International Affairs and Bob Bowie extremely angry. So there was a lot of crockery broken in the process. But so then we built this building, and this building, the objective was to have a footprint of what was now coming to be envisaged as a more substantial school of government, and the Institute of Politics would be part of it. And the building is a whole other story. Well, about the building, there's 100 stories to tell, but I just, if I go to the heart of the matter, okay. So there had been a great controversy over the library. The library had been designed by I.M. Pei. I.M. Pei is a great international architect, but is hopeless in terms of how buildings are used. So we needed a functional building, not an architectural statement. And the functional needed to do several things. First, needed to keep its head down so that we wouldn't have a new controversy. So if you look, the cornice line of our building is just slightly lower than the cornice line across the street. Secondly, I determined, and Derek was very keen about this too, it was going to look like Harvard. So brick. So the architects kept wanting to build concrete. No, I said, brick. And they would come back half concrete. No, not half. Brick. Okay, how about brick? Okay. So over and over we did brick. Okay, and then next it wanted to remind you a little bit of Harvard. So what does Harvard look like? So I went with, walking around Harvard to see what Harvard looks like. Harvard looks like brick, looks like Georgian, looks like slate, looks like chimneys, looks like cupolas. That's it. So that was the design thing for them. Okay, brick. Okay. How about slate roof? So you look at the slate. How about chimneys? Well, we couldn't have fireplaces, though we had finally one in the dean's office, but we have these light things that look like chimneys. And I would have had a cupola, but we didn't have any money for a cupola, and Derek was nervous about a cupola, so we ended up not having a cupola. And the guy next door, Heimert, who was the dean, was the master of Eliot House, kept accusing me that we were going to steal his cupola and move it over. We looked at it, but I think that would be too big of a stretch. And the function was going to be of the building to be a place where people would mix in classrooms and offices. But and we were building everything we could pay for, plus a little more. But as we just were about to start construction of the building, Frank Stanton, who had been the president of CBS, who built CBS, and who had become chairman of the visiting committee and was a wonderful, wonderful guy, looked at it and he said, this is a boring building. And Frank had built the Saarinen building, BlackRock, for CBS in New York. So he had a great taste, for stuff. He said, I understand you're not doing IMP and too bad, but in any case, this building is boring. So he said, why didn't there at least be an idea in the building? And the architects thought this was horrible. They were young architects. They've since become famous. But Frank said, put some imagination into it. So we invented, with another guy, Ira Jackson, the Forum. And I had been extremely interested before. Every summer I go to Greece and had studied ancient Greece when I was in college. So the agora, where it was like a marketplace in the daytime, but you might see Socrates there, doing his philosophy and people debating things, was a very attractive idea. And I had seen the Oxford Union at Oxford, which is a great place for debate. At Harvard, there was no such equivalent. So we invented the Forum as an idea. And basically, if you look at the building, it's just an L. We just sort of pulled it apart a little bit and made this sort of thing in the middle. Well, the architect said, "Oh, this is just crazy. Here we've already got a building, half designed. You can't pull the thing in the middle, and then you have to have a staircase, and how is this going to work, and so forth and so on." So it was a long, maybe 2-3 weeks of every day, dragging out. This is a terrible idea, and us thinking it's a good idea. And then finally, one of the architects, Joe Maybank, sort of like a light went on in his head, and he got it. And so he said, I think this probably could work. And so he began to do some design, and he ultimately ended up with something that's architecturally a masterpiece for balance, and whose acoustics are fantastic, but which gives a school the equivalent of a town meeting hall, which is it's an expression of what we are and what we do. And I think the fact that the Forum has become the premier place for public debate is appropriate. And Harvard had a natural claim to that, but nobody else had claimed it, so we did. And the Forum expresses it very well. But it also is a place where you can go and you don't know who's going to be walking through the Forum or who's going to see who or who sees what. And now, actually, it seems like a normal idea. So when other schools build schools of government or public policy, they come here and they, do copies of the Forum. So I was off in Oxford last week. They're building a new building. They'd been here studying the Forum. They said, if you were doing it over, how would you do it different? I said, I'd make it 50% bigger. I mean, we made it bigger than we could pay for at the time, but it would be better if it was 50% bigger. Not hugely bigger. We don't want it to be a great auditorium because it has this intimacy. It also has a great attraction, if you at a Forum event, that because people are not in fixed seats for most of the space, the audience is in the act in a way that's not the case if you go into a fixed theater, where everybody has to sit in their seats, and that's where it is. So you can say to a speaker, there's people on the third floor, and they're walking around, and there's some other stuff going on, and if you talk too long or it's too boring, they're going to leave, or they're going to get up, and they're not used to it. And so it gives people a very different feeling. I also think for the interactions for people from the loggians. So when we did the dedication of the building, so this is the fall of 1978, so just a year after I'd become dean, or just barely. We had a number of major events here, and so Teddy would sit in the loge, one of the lodges, and some speaker's speaking, and he gets up and asks a question, and then there's debate back and forth. So that's when he was finally feeling like, he was finally feeling like, okay, so maybe this place is going to be okay. Yeah. As I mentioned, I had grown up here, become a professor, taken leave, come back, been an associate dean, was hoping that a Democrat would be elected and that I would have a chance to go to Washington. There needed to be somebody as dean. One of the key requirements for whoever was going to be dean would be that they would be able to raise money to finance the place. And so my first idea was Nelson Rockefeller, who had been governor, who now didn't have a job, who was a Harvard person. That would have been actually, and I said if he would be the dean, I would stay as associate dean. Let him do the fundraising. I'll do the building of the program. Derek said, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, so then I said, well, Dunlop should be the dean. And Derek liked Dunlop. And if Dunlop would have been willing to do it, I think that would have got settled. But Newstead had determined that Graham should do it, and I was determined that I would go to Washington. So Carter gets elected. So I said to Dunlop, okay, so it's a Democrat. He said, I know. He's so tight with Labor that he could be appointed by a Democrat just as well as by a Republican. Okay, so he's still looking to be appointed Secretary of Labor. I looked around at opportunities, and finally Mr. Lance, who was Carter's buddy from Georgia, who had been a banker, became director of Office of Management and Budget. And he offered me a job as a deputy director. And I accepted the job. And this was like on I can't remember, a Thursday. So I then was ashamed to tell, or afraid to tell Derek. So I wrote him a note and I said, I've accepted a job working for Director Lance, and so Dunlop can become dean, because Dunlop they had already appointed the cabinet, so there's no job for him. And Derek rejected this idea and came and said to me, Harvard's been extremely good to you, and it's your duty to do this job here now. So I thought that was a pretty bold statement from the president of the university, but it had some merit, not more than a little merit, because Harvard had been extremely good to me, and I'd grown up here. So I went back to Mr. Lance on the Monday or Tuesday and said to him, I have bad news. I'm not able to serve in the job that I accepted on whatever Thursday. And so he was shocked, but in any case, he got over it. And then within about a year, he was in trouble for some banking thing he had done before he became director of OMB. So I always have taken that as a good example of the proposition that God looks after drunk little children and the USA and me. I've been having time as associate dean to think about, could you make this thing viable?
You're building the school at the same
We're
time.
building a building, yeah.
So
So we know there's going to be a building. We know there's going to be a public policy program. But there's still a question of, okay, so how's this going to work? Because you've built something you can't finance, and you have space for programs you don't have. So I had an idea of what it could be. I kept struggling with the notion. So here was this vision that Derek had articulated of the public service and 4 pillars. It was clear to me that was not a viable vision. So I had been working on the problem of, so what would constitute a vision for a place that might be viable, and then what could be a strategy that would go with it, on the notion that maybe Derek succeeds in forcing me to do this job, but in any case, maybe Nelson Rockefeller would do it, in which case, if he said he'll do his part, what would it look like? So I came up with a vision, which I thought was viable, and which Derek then initially didn't like, but ultimately agreed to. So I called it Box Canonical Objectives. And he said, no, yeah, it's much better if it's the president of the university says. Okay, so the Box Canonical Objectives were twofold. First, to become a substantial professional school of government that serves society's demands for excellence in government in many of the ways Harvard schools of medicine, law, and business serve their respective private professions. So the big idea is substantial professional school like these big guys. And then the second was to be the hub of the university-wide program in public policy and management, drawing on the resources of the whole university. That was a kind of courtesy a little bit to the previous vision, and also because it was clear we don't need to try to replicate the capabilities that exist at the law school or the business school. So this vision I would put at the top of every piece of paper. The faculty came to the point where they could recite it in unison virtually. So it helped us get an idea. What were we trying to do? So we were trying to be a substantial professional school, like the business school, the law school, the medical school. So that means big. That means with a range of programs. So it just basically lifted our ambitions way beyond anything realistic. But in any case, if you could have such a thing, it would be worthy and worthwhile. And since already, and actually I tried to root this in Harvard tradition, so I spent some time studying, the Harvard story. It was, and it's a very interesting story. 200 years before, Harvard had created a medical school. When it created a medical school, there weren't medical schools. And there wasn't much to medicine. And wasn't much known about medicine. Actually, doctors were probably harming people. But in any case, it created a medical school. And over time, it grew up and it became to be a great credit to the world. Then 100 years ago, Harvard had created a law school. Before that, lawyers didn't go to law school. They just apprenticed to some lawyer, and then they became a lawyer. So John Adams was a lawyer. He didn't go to law school. But in any case, law schools came to be something that was a recognized thing. Then 50 years ago, Harvard had created a business school. And actually, at the time, it was thinking of creating a Kennedy School. But it created a business school, or a school of government. But it rejected that in favor of business. Business school didn't actually amount to much for almost the first 50 years. So during World War II, the business school almost went away. But then it grew up to be something that was, so the notion was, okay, so Harvard has already done this 3 times. Why not, for government and public policy, given the role of government and public policy in the society? So the first thing was to get a vision. And the second thing was to have a strategy that was connected to a viable vision that could conceivably be executed. So the strategy had to include how to finance this, okay, so a very substantial chunk of financing or fundraising. And again, ideally, when Derek asked me to become dean, I said, okay, but I'm not going to have anything to do with fundraising. So he sent me, I have a letter actually, that says, you won't have any responsibility for fundraising. That and 25 cents to get you a subway ride, or not 25 cents, $1, okay? But it needed to have a faculty that would be appointed who was committed to the mission. So that was another piece of the strategy. And it needed to have programs that clearly connected to its purposes in the world. So the building of executive programs is a much more plausible way to show that there's a connection between what we're doing, and to make sure there is a connection between what we're doing and what's happening in the practice of public administration and public policy. Similarly, the research centers, which seem to me to be, if you said, where can you almost for sure add value with respect to public policy, it's in independent, objective research and analysis that explores and analyzes the dynamics of the challenges and identifies ways of intervening that could make the world better. So the first of the research centers in the school was the one that I'm currently the director of, the Center for Science and International Affairs, which had been a program, but then through some complicated process, we moved to become the first research center in the school and to be a good illustration of it. And then we did a deal with McGeorge Bundy and the Ford Foundation to get the funding for it, which ultimately converted into endowments. But that's another long story. Yeah. If you say, what is the Kennedy School, or what is the law school? Well, now it's got a brand, so it has an image, but at the time we didn't have a brand or an image. We had Harvard, okay, that has a big name, Kennedy, which is a name, but then what is it? Who are we? What do we do? What do we teach? What do we research? So that's ultimately the product of a faculty. So the kind of the central both respiratory and nervous system of a university school is its faculty, and we'd started with this wonderful group of people, but recruiting and maintaining and sustaining and appointing a faculty of people who would be as committed to the mission and who would be able to contribute. Well, we're hiring in a space that doesn't really exist because it's for a form of teaching and learning that doesn't exist. So for the Schellings of the world, they've already grown up to be a professor in the economics department, but they kind of know they're more interested in public policy issues, and so they get, move them over. Well, how do you actually, so one way to do is pirate people who are already here. So they already got to be a professor for being famous as a historian. Ernie May is a great example. But capture some of his time and imagination for working on public policy issues. So I would say that was one piece of the strategy. So Joe Nye was a professor in the Gov department and had been director of the Weatherhead, what's now the Weatherhead Center in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He's a good close friend. So I just recruited him over to, be at the Kennedy School. So that's one person. And secondly, in hiring assistant professors, we hired some of the absolutely best assistant professors who otherwise would have gone to the economics department or the political science department or others, but mainly by picking them out and recruiting them. So how did Mike Spence, who went on to win a Nobel Prize and be the dean of the business school at Stanford, how did we get him? Well, he was clearly a smart guy when he was in, a graduate student, but somehow some combination of Schelling, me, Zeckhauser, would see him, would talk to him, wouldn't get it. So it was like case by case. Elwood, actually, was a great case. So here he's a distinguished star. He and Dutch both, Leonard, graduate, from the economics department. They both are highly recruited, young assistant professors. We recruited him to the Kennedy School by talking to him over and over, saying, "There's an opportunity for you to go do something that will make a bigger difference." And
did people, the faculty that you're looking at, obviously some of them at Harvard must have known about the Kennedy School, but they must have been a little uncertain about what it was that they would.
They did, and they would often be getting on a boat, and you don't quite know where it's going to go, and you don't even know it's going to stay afloat for the whole time. So there's a lot of retail case by case, and actually in that, Neustadt had been a great example because he would spend, all day long engaging people to make them feel like they're part of something that that would make a big difference. So I think for faculty was an absolutely key part. For students, again, originally the public policy class was essentially recruited the way we recruited faculty. So Neustadt would go and find an extra talented student and recruit them. Not just let them apply and see what happens. And so we had a element of that right through of recruiting, excellent students, and then getting a dean of students for whom that was a task, not just taking applicants and selecting, but actually going out and beating the bushes and finding the people that you thought would be most likely to make the biggest difference. So I think we had the hiring of the key people doing the key jobs, a crucial part. Then for the curriculum, the basic structure of the curriculum was settled in that original curriculum, exercise when the place was started. But then building the curriculum and developing different fields was a very interesting component. So in statistics, Mosteller and another fellow named Fairley and another lady, Edith Stokey, were developing more applied statistics, not just traditional statistical methods, but how do you deal with messy data sets. And in the political analysis course that Neustadt and I taught, we were developing a whole new thing. Actually, that was built to some extent on the book that I had written, that became Essence of Decision, which had been a product of this study group at the Institute of Politics. So it's all pretty incestuous. For the history for analysis, after I recruited Ernie May to spend most of his time here, he and Neustadt, and then Phil Zellico, and now we have some other professors here, basically were exploring the uses of history as both a source of data about public policy issues, but also a mode of reasoning. So I would say, again, there's a level of engagement with the attempt to develop the activity. I'd say one of the areas we've tried the hardest, and I would say least successfully, is in the public management space, where Mark Moore and Phil Hyman, a professor at the law school, and Joe Bauer, a professor at the business school, worked in this space. But if you said, we should have at the school today 10 professors of public management and public administration if we were doing what we should be doing. Well, why haven't we been more successful at building and developing that? I think it's not for lack of trying. It's just that for whatever combination of reasons, that part didn't work as successfully as we should have done. Similarly, we should have 10 professors of science, technology, and health, science, technology, and environment, science, technology, and security, science, technology, and cyber. So why have we not developed that space? Well, we hadn't got around to doing it. So I'd say there's a whole bunch of things that are, remain to be done. But I'd say for the core activity, the curriculum, that was built pretty much in that fashion. And for the research centers, the idea was that in my original strategy for the school, so you've got the mission, then you have 3 divisions of activities. You have the core degree programs, the MPP and the MPA. You have the executive programs, which serve 2 purposes. First, faculty education. So if a faculty member has to go into a room of 100 seasoned managers and engage them, he or she has to know something about what they're doing. And so that actually gives them an anchor to the real world. But then thirdly, the research centers, where most faculty, I would say, would, in my vision, have at least 2 legs to their work. One, kind of the more, if they teach economics and public policy, or statistics and public policy, or political analysis and public policy. But then secondly, some area of policy where they are advancing knowledge, so about social policy, or about international security, or about energy and environment, or about press and public policy. So the research centers provide a critical mass of faculty and postdocs and pre-docs and people who are coming back and forth from the real world to give us a chance to advance policy relevant knowledge in these spaces. And I'd say that, if you look at the products of the school, a product like David's book, Poor Support, which informed the Clinton health welfare reform, or a book like my nuclear terrorism book, which is reflected in the Obama agenda, or a book like, or the work of Stavins on cap and trade, which was reflected in the SOX and NOx, and now has been part of at least the debate about climate. Or if you look at actually the energy technology innovation agenda for the Obama administration, and the studies that John Holdren did before he went to be the president's science advisor, you can see pretty direct transmission of creation of ideas that are policy relevant and their translation into policies that may have some impact. And I think for the school, having these three elements, the core degree programs, the executive programs, and the research centers actually have the right synergy. So I think strategically that was a viable idea, and I think it's been sustained. Well, I think that certainly for the first, 4 or 5 years, we went from, sort of one bit of being terrified to the next. I have to try to get some examples here. The fundraising turned out to be something that I was more successful at than I had anticipated. Mainly it's just hard work, but again, it was a matter of finding somebody that was doing it and asking them and trying to understand best practice and try. And so at one stage I said I was earning about $100 an hour, and then I got to making $1,000 an hour, and by the end I was at $10,000 or $15,000 an hour. But that takes a lot of hours, for the first of the research centers, because once we had one that was clear what it was, it became easier to, give an account of what the next one would look like. So the program that had been created by Paul Doty for Science and International Affairs clearly was a topic that would be a good fit for us, given my interest, given Schelling's interest, given Neustat's interest, given the history of Harvard. And so while it took a huge amount of hours, the Ford Foundation was ultimately willing to give us a grant, which if we matched, we could save their money and use it for endowment, which is what became the endowment for the center to allow it to exist in the long run. For professorships, we had some, I guess after Frank Stanton became chairman of the visiting committee, he was a person of great standing in the New York establishment. So he was able to be very helpful in opening some doors for fundraising purposes and also, doing it himself. But
was it
as things, the new building opens, you've got more space than people. Once people are here and they see the forum, and the forum end up working. I had envisaged the general idea of the forum, but then the first director, Nick Metropolis, was very inventive in trying to do the programming, and pretty soon, one thing was feeding the other. So, within a year, I would say, we had established the premier locus on campus for a debate about public policy issues. Well, that's pretty exciting. So that would be more exciting for the faculty that, okay, now these things are happening. Well, if you're having such a thing, more people come so they see what is the Kennedy School. So it's not just this noise, or, it's not just a piece of paper or a briefing chart. It's they can see how it's working. It turned out I never would have imagined this, but the things that the forums get televised, well, then people see them elsewhere. So more students get recruited that way than get recruited by the guy, goes to campus saying, hey, we have a public policy program. So I think the synergies worked better than I certainly ever would have anticipated. We almost had perfectly wrong timing for trying to build a school of government as compared to, if you look at it historically. So historically you would say, here's Franklin Roosevelt, a Harvard president, the New Deal, this great expansion of government during the New Deal and in World War II. The Littauer School was established in 1936. So when would you be able to ride a wave? Right then. Okay? So that should have happened, I think. And actually, I think Mr. Littauer's idea was a great idea. Just didn't fit the realities of politics at Harvard at the time. Then Kennedy gets elected. Well, again, what an opportunity, because the country was sort of caught up with romantic hopes and aspirations. A lot of Harvard people are involved. So again, that would have been a pretty natural phase. When I became dean in '77, Carter had just got elected. And while most people don't remember Carter this way, Carter actually was viscerally very anti-government. He from Georgia, and his experience as a farmer, his whole idea of government was very convoluted, very, very complex. By 1981, Reagan becomes president. In his inaugural address, he says, there's one of these lines I remember over and over, government is not the solution to the problems. Government is the problem. Hey, wait a minute. We're trying to raise money for School of Government. Hey, guy's telling you it's the problem. Okay? Then we had the name Kennedy. We were already, at Harvard, which was at the time called the Kremlin on the Charles, okay? In Massachusetts, where we have Kennedy and Democrats. So people say, well, this is a Democratic whorehouse. Okay? You can't be a School of Government. And Reagan is the president, and it's a Republican administration. So we spent a lot of time, and I spent a huge amount of time, and have scars to show for it, trying to make credible that we were not just a Democratic school, but that we were about improving government and public policy per se, that we weren't about big government. We were about whether government was going to be effective government. So, it's not about the size. Government's here to stay. The question is, how well does it do its job? So we recruited, as much as possible, visible Republicans who would be part of who appreciated the enterprise. And they were not only guys like Elliot Richardson, who was a very established traditional Massachusetts Rockefeller-like Republican, but John Connally, who had been in the car with Kennedy when he was assassinated, who had been governor of Texas, and a Republican of great standing, he and I became good friends. I visited him often, and he would stand up and say, strange, place at Harvard. It's strange these guys are, Democrats, but I'm telling, this is something that I believe in. So we end up getting, I think, people who were enlightened to the argument against having more intelligence in government and more commitment to public ethic in government is a pretty hard argument to resist if you if you really get down and get beneath the symbolism. And Reagan actually was very, very interesting in this regard because his Secretary of Defense was Weinberger. Reagan and Weinberger were about this vast expansion of the defense budget and the defense undertaking. So I would always say to Weinberger, and Weinberger I knew from before, and actually he didn't end up being his special advisor as a consulting role for part of the time. So I said to him, you can't say government is the problem and government can't do anything and give me more money for the defense and the military. That doesn't work. Okay? So Weinberger said, well, okay, the rest of the government doesn't work. Defense works. I said, that's not right at all. So he was also helpful in basically saying the Kennedy School and Harvard can play a role in helping maintain and sustain the kind of capabilities we want to have in government. And so then we did the executive program for new generals and admirals and their civilian equivalents. And so that became to be, for people that are, unless they were just hopelessly ideological, gave us a little bit of balance. But all the time, and I think even today, maybe especially today, people still look and say, yeah, but aren't you guys, more a Democratic operation than a Republican one? So I think we need to work harder to make sure that we convey that we're not partisan, even those individuals are Democrats or Republicans. Certainly for myself, for Neustadt, actually I don't think there was hardly any objection here. Ernie May, a great example. And if you look at the constitutional set of requirements, providing for the common defense comes up, high up on the list. Harvard has a great tradition of relations with the military. So many Harvard graduates were part of the Revolution, but Harvard actually has the second largest, other than the service academies, the most Medal of Honor winners are from Harvard, as Drew Faust pointed out in bringing ROTC home. So when Ernie, the first of the executive programs that we established that we were the control of was the program for generals and admirals and their civilian equivalents, which Ernie May was the chair of. I was the dean. And made plain that on this part of the campus, people in uniform were serving, and we honored them, and we appreciated the role that they play in keeping us safe. On campus, this was now Vietnam time, military was not too popular, and then ultimately ROTC was kicked off of campus by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. But the Kennedy School, we've had a long-standing tradition of being very welcoming. We've had great students from the military academies. We've had serving officers in the executive programs. And actually, we've had a research program that interacts significantly. And a number of people from this school have served in the Defense Department, not just in the military, but in the civilian. So Joe was a Assistant Secretary of Defense. I was an Assistant Secretary of Defense. Deutsch, who's on our board, was a Deputy Secretary. John White was Deputy Secretary. Ash Carter's off now as Undersecretary. So I think in terms of what you would wish to have in the school, the relationship between the military and defense establishment on the one hand, and both the research and the teaching here, and the executive programs, is a very healthy symbiosis. And I think Drew Faust, to her credit, in welcoming ROTC back, pointed out that this is in Harvard's greatest tradition. I mean, there's a reason why this bridge here is called Soldiers Field bridge. And there's this reason why the thing across the river is called Soldiers Field, and it's because of a long Harvard history. There was a president of the University of Chicago back in the 60s or 70s, Hutchins, and he said, it ain't very good, but it's the best there is. So I would say the school is not very good, even though it's better than any of its competitors. And actually, that's a little too, harsh. I'd say that it's in many areas the school has got lots to be proud of, but as compared to what we could be achieving for the capabilities and resources and opportunities we have, most days I'm impressed with the shortfall as compared to the performance. So if you look and you say, well, how is government performing? Well, not very well. Okay, so whose fault is that? Well, I would not say that it's our fault, but if you said, but your purpose is excellence in government, to improve the performance of governance for our society, so how are you doing? So I'd say, well, in some areas we've made some significant contributions that we can be proud of. I got a phone call this morning from the press folks in Moscow who are doing a big set of preparation for stories on the 20th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'd forgot the timing of this. And they wanted to talk about what happened to the nuclear weapons that were left outside of Russia. I'd say that's a great story for the school, and one that there's 10 people here that did a lot of work on that. I'm included, but Ash, Holdren, and lo and behold, 0 of these nuclear weapons has been found lost or stolen. He was saying, well, how could this be? I said, I don't know. I'd say we should give thanks every morning to God for for grace and good fortune. But there were some smart things that were done. Most of them by Russians, but some by Americans. So I would say that's a good story. I think if you look at the welfare reform story, that's a good story. One where the school, not everything's right, but with many things to be proud of. If you look at the quality of the people who are coming, I'd say we're very proud of each class that shows up. And are they going full of good spirit as they go back? Yes. But if you said, well, but how's all this working? You'd say, again, we can't work magic, but this is a troubled, I'd say the question of how well is the American government working, I'd say deeply troubling. And what are we doing to eliminate that and to suggest ways, that it could be done better? Well, I don't know. What could we do that we're not doing? Well, more, for sure, and maybe different, maybe smarter. I don't have here's my 6-point plan, but I'd say that I think the good news is that there's no question you arrive at Harvard and the Kennedy School of Government or Harvard Kennedy School exists. It's a substantial school. It's got funding and programs and people and faculty. And so, what's compared to the other schools, it's now a fact. So I'd say I take some satisfaction in that. When I came back from Oxford as a student here, I think the first year Neustadt was teaching his first course on the presidency. I took it. It was an exciting course. And then he asked me to become his course assistant, and so became a mentor and friend. He then was trying to invent the Institute of Politics. So one of the things that he thought of doing was creating a study group of distinguished academics who would be talking about a problem of interest. And he got Ernest May to be the chairman. He was a member. But the members were a luminary group that included Kissinger, Bill Kaufman from MIT, Freddie Clay, Adam Yarmolinsky, who had worked for Kennedy in the Justice Department. And this group would meet every Saturday or two, and they needed a rapporteur, and I was hired to be the rapporteur, so I'd write up some notes from whatever happened at the meeting and try to advance the conversation. The problem that they were meeting about was a so-called bureaucracy problem, which was why the best laid plans of mice and men so badly go awry, and the case in question was Vietnam as an example. And at the same time, I was a graduate student, so I was trying to think of what would I write my thesis on. I, as I mentioned before, had done philosophy at Oxford and been much impacted by analytic philosophy. And so, I don't know, one thing led to the other. I needed to write a thesis. I had been getting this input from this group that was helping me better understand the fact that just having a good paper analysis of a problem that has option A and option B and option C, independent of whether those options were likely through organizational and political processes to produce the effects that were assessed as costs and benefits, was not likely to work. So I came up with a conceptualization, which then ultimately became Essence of Decision. So Essence of Decision is two books in one. The first is Alternative Conceptual Frameworks for Understanding Decision Making in a Complex Organization, looking particularly at governments. And I identify the conceptual framework that most people use most of the time, which is basically a personification of a government and the attempt to explain its behavior as if it was purposive, reflecting some rational, deliberate calculation among options. But then two alternative conceptual frameworks, an organizational behavior model and a bureaucratic politics model, that are more like what really happens. And again, the question is how you can use these three different sets of conceptual lenses to clarify what's actually going on in the decision process in a case. So the case I chose was the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I was fascinated by the possibility that we would have found ourselves in a nuclear war. I'd been a student at Oxford at the time of the missile crisis, and many people, including myself, believed there was some very substantial chance we were all going to be blown up. And this seemed to me like a bummer for a young man. That case was now, this was 1967, so it was 5 years old. So not that much information had been released about it, though a lot. So I did my research, and then over the course of a summer out at the Rand Corporation, where I was working in Santa Monica, pretty much produced the first draft of the thesis. I got some wonderful feedback from people there that helped, make it better, and then very good criticism from Neustadt and Schelling and others. And so then I did a revised version of it, and finally it passed. And so I think in 1968 I got stamped okay and became an assistant professor. I then revised the book, I guess I wrote an article version of it for the American Political Science Review as part of a young person trying to grow up as an academic, and then revised the book, and it was published in '71. Publisher didn't have much aspiration for the book. I think they printed 5,000 copies, and fortunately, it had already in the draft version that had been produced as a Rand draft paper, had a sort of samizdat or underground circulation in various places. And so pretty quickly the book took off, and ultimately became one of the best sellers ever in political science. So since I make 50 cents a copy and is now sold about 450,000 copies, and that's been a good run. Back in 2000 or 2001, with another former faculty member here, Phil Zellico, we did a second edition because in the meantime, a whole lot of more data had come forth, and then ultimately it was discovered that Kennedy had secretly taped the deliberations of this executive committee of the National Security Council. Zellico said, well, how about we do a transcript of this tape? I had listened to one of the tapes earlier because I didn't know that they would have been all taped. But they're very scratchy and they're hard to get in. So I said no. And so ultimately Philip did this and produced a book called The Kennedy Tapes with Ernie. But that then became best data for revision purposes. So the revised edition was published, I think, in 2001 and still is, lively and still sells, I don't remember, 5,000 or 10,000 copies a year. So it's been a great success. I'd say the analytic frameworks as ways of understanding the complexities of decision making by governments or by universities or by corporations remains quite valid and valuable. And actually, it's taught as much in business schools today as in schools of government and public policy. But in government and public policy, it's now kind of part of the accepted picture. So I'm happy to have written it. Fred Mosteller once said, after I had become dean, he said that if you ever do a good piece of work, the world will conspire to get you so entangled that you won't have a chance to write another book like that. So,
but you did, though, with your work on nuclear terrorism, a distinguished academic career. Would you say that's perhaps the other thing that you?
Well, I'm happy for dozens of things that I have done, and when I get up in the mornings, actually got ideas or what get my juices flowing, and I've got too many projects unfinished, currently. But if you said what is the continuing thread in this story, nuclear weapons and the attempt to do whatever is possible to prevent their being used to kill lots of people has been a pretty compelling continuing thread. So in the missile crisis, Kennedy thought there was somewhere between 1 in 3 an even chance that this was going to ultimately end in war. They think, yikes! And how many people would have been killed? Probably 100 million. So that's impossible to contemplate, but in any case, it concentrates the mind. In the period since then, there was a project here that I ran jointly with Joe Nye and Al Carnesale called Avoiding Nuclear War, and we produced 3 or 4 books in that project, one on hawks, doves, and owls, and one on fateful visions, one on windows of opportunity, still tracing this thread of nuclear weapons and how might they spread and how might they be used. And with the end of the Soviet Union, I was, along with Ash and 3 or 4 other people here, preoccupied with the notion of what's going to happen to the nuclear weapons. And so we were part of the support efforts that became Nunn-Lugar, a piece of legislation that was bold and imaginative from Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar, a Republican and a Democrat. And then when Clinton was elected, I became Assistant Secretary of Defense, in which my job was all the nuclear weapons left outside of Russia. So Clinton said to me, you get up every morning and go to bed every night You think about all those weapons, and if any one of them gets used, that's your ass. Okay, I was pretty concentrated, and fortunately, the Luger program and its authorities and its funds provided means for. And by the end of the story, as far as we know, no nuclear. We know for sure no nuclear weapons were used, and I think as far as we know, 20 years on, it looks like 0 nuclear weapons are outside of Russia, and actually 0 nuclear weapons have come loose from Russia in, a whole weapon. Some material has come loose, but not a whole weapon. So that I think has been again, something to be thankful for. But then in 2004, I published a book called Nuclear Terrorism, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, which looks at the issue and says, if we just imagine these trajectories, how in the world is it possible that terrorists won't succeed in getting a nuclear weapon and blowing up a city like a nuclear 9/11? And so it says it's inevitable. And then part 2 of the book says it's preventable. And the juxtaposition of the two is a little bit of paradox, but the proposition is if everybody just keeps doing what they're doing, it's inevitable. But that there exist actions that we could take that if we took might bend these trend lines in such a way that we would reduce the likelihood to nearly 0. So that book, I think, has been very well received, and actually President Obama read it when he was on a trip to Russia with Lugar. So they're riding along on the bus, and he's sitting there reading this book, and so it helped inform his thinking. And the agenda that he's been pursuing is very consistent with what's laid out there. Now, unfortunately, the trend lines that are leading us to something fairly catastrophic are very powerfully propelled, and so bending them is not a matter of just giving a speech or just initiating a program. It's a matter of a huge amount of hard work every day. And fortunately, there's a lot of excellent people in the administration working on this problem every day, including many of them graduates of the Kennedy School or former fellows at the Belfer Center. So I'm in Washington every week urging people on or offering my 2 cents about this or about that. But if you look at the plus column and the minus column, at this stage, I'd say in the plus column, a big plus is a president who absolutely gets it. So you wake him up in the middle of the night, he's sure this is the greatest threat to the U.S. So I'd say that's fantastic, and who's determined to do what he can do about it. So that's fantastic. The people that are working for him on it include some of the best people possible. So Gary Seymour, who's a former fellow at Belfer, is the czar for the White House doing this. His deputy is Laura Holgate. She was also a person from the Belfer Center. At the Defense Department is Michelle Flournoy, the Undersecretary for Policy. She's also a Belfer person. Her deputy is Jim Miller. He's also Belfer. So this is a pretty, incestuous. Dan Poneman is the Deputy Secretary at Energy. He's also a former Belfer. So it's a pretty, compatible group. And all these people are working at it very hard, but there's a guy in Iran, and he's working very hard too. And there's a guy in North Korea, and he's working very hard. So there's guys in Pakistan, and they're working very hard. So at this stage, I would say it's still very, very uncertain how the thing's going to turn out. And I wouldn't, and I haven't revised my bet that on the current trajectory, which I would say we're still more or less on, before the end of 2014, there's a better than even chance, not 100%, but 51%, that the terrorists will somehow successfully explode a nuclear weapon somewhere.
Well, on that rather somber note,
have a nice day, yes.
Allison, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.